Hi, I'm Chai-Yoel Korn, and my gender pronouns are they, them. And the visible things that you'll be able to see about me are that I'm quite, in terms of race, quite ethnic looks. You probably can assume a gender and assume a sexuality. So in terms of gender, I'm non-binary, and in terms of sexuality, identify as queer. I gave up feeling like I was a member of the gay community quite a long time ago due to my disability and kind of access being limited in the gay community. But also, yeah, our identity shapes and shifts with time. And obviously I'm here, so I'm Jewish. Um, and I live with a disability, which you probably would be able to see more in person. In terms of kind of the invisible sides, um, I guess my gender queerness until you kind of started speaking to me. I live with HIV, and kind of you wouldn't be able to kind of see class, marital status, I'm single, and Jewishness obviously is the common thread in the room. So that's a quick overview.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to dive a little bit more into some of that, just to introduce myself a little bit more deeply as well. Not necessarily to you, Chai-Yoel, you know me pretty well, but to anyone who doesn't, I'm Rabbi Natasha. I think one of the reasons that I got asked to do this, as well as having a connection with Chai-Yoel, I also am a queer person. I'm bisexual. I am no longer the only queer rabbi of the Masorti movement in the UK, which is great. But I was the first, at least the first to be out. I suppose we never know what's gone on before us. I'm also a person of color. I'm a mixed race individual. My father is from India. And I am a convert to Judaism. So I converted as a teenager. So I've sort of been on the outside of Jewish community as well as on the inside of Jewish community. As well as, of course, like learning how to do Jewish life and Jewish ritual and Jewish engagement as a woman, which has its own set of complications, especially in the more traditional world. We're really here to talk about you, Chai-Yoel, not to talk about me. But I'm glad that I get to be the one who does this with you. I just want to start us out before we sort of dive into some of the conversation that we're having, just with sort of a few points of order, so to speak. I know everyone else who's in the room has been brutally silenced. You are on mute. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We do have the chat. It would be, if you have questions as we go along, please do ask them in the chat. I will have half an eye on the chat. So if anything comes up that I feel like it would be useful for us to get into at that moment, I may bring it up. We will have some time, some room for questions at the end. It is up to you if you want to put your questions in as you go and as they come to you, or if you would like to save them. And also just to say, we're going to talk about some pretty sensitive things, I think, and it's a bit of a vulnerable conversation, and it's a lot to ask of you, Chai-Yoel, and I know that I'm really honoured that you're doing this for us. I'm going to try my best not to ask you questions that might be a little bit too vulnerable, a bit too sensitive. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you questions about like your medical life with gender, because those are always inappropriate, let alone in front of a room full of people that you don't know very well. If I do tread on anything that I shouldn't be treading on, I just want to invite you to just say, we're just going to go to one side of that. There is, I will not be at all offended by that, and I hope you won't be offended by any ways in which I might tread where I shouldn't. But I'm going to ask you, if you will, just to start us out in your sort of early life identity, relationship with all this stuff. And we'll try and stick to something vaguely chronological as we move through time. So take it away, please.
Okay. So I guess, I mean, it's quite a difficult memory, but I guess I first started to understand kind of being different, being queer. I went to a modern Orthodox um, school and synagogue and lived in a modern Orthodox community. And the first time I kind of started discovering my identity was when a friend came from school, came and stayed over. We kind of fooled around a bit, and I then went to the school counselor and said, I'm not sure, there's something different about me. I'm not sure if I'm gay or not. This was around aged 11 or 12. It was in the midst of when Section 28 was still at play. I'm also not sure today whether it was just a good community member kind of taking on the school councillor role. But they said to me, well, you know, outside this room, don't tell anybody. It's not a safe place to be gay. And so for a very long time, until I was 16, 17 years old, I kind of kept it a secret. And that was, I guess, slightly problematic. So I met my first partner when I was 17. Back then it was the age of consent was 21 initially, then went down to 18, and then went down to 16. But when I came out, it still wasn't okay to be gay under 18. I have led quite a secretive life. So at home, I was, yeah, seen as quite straight. But I had this secret kind of romance life and a secret life away from that. My first partner contracted HIV, and 6 months on from their diagnosis, unfortunately, they died of HIV, because the medication was very experimental at the time. So those were kind of the beginning stages of me finding my identity. And for a long time, I guess, when I finally kind of came out, I felt like I had to choose either to have a queer life or to have a Jewish life.
Mm.
For a long time, I lived in South London or anywhere but North London because I didn't feel like I belonged. Um, Fortunately, years later, I've now come back to North London, and I feel a bit more like I belong because I have a nice synagogue, this New London synagogue, which allows me to bring my full self to the synagogue. I don't need to hide any parts of me.
I didn't pay them to say that. Can I just take you back into some of that a little bit more slowly? You talked about being age 11, 12, which I think is, is a really interesting age, right? This is the age of going into being sort of b'nai mitzvah and having this sense of self that exists outside of the community. And that's the time in which you're sort of learning about who you are in terms of sexuality and also what's going on. Like, can you just define for us, what the world is looking like as 11-year-old Chai-Yoel is starting to grapple with these ideas?
So I guess, I mean, I went to mainly Jewish schools from zero to 16. So I lived in a very conservative, modern Orthodox community. I would say also a very loving family, but a very conservative family as well. And yeah, didn't know anybody that was gay in the community, and I don't imagine it would have been safe to be out as gay. There was lots of kind of gossip that went on in the community, and I don't imagine that the community would have been very kind in terms of queerness. Also, kind of from the age of 8 to 16, I was bullied initially around kind of being a bit tubby, having freckles, and then kind of queerness, and I was kind of singled out for that. School wasn't an inclusive space, secondary school particularly. The games teacher would see some of the bullying that went on, and he would turn a blind eye, or put me in the disability toilet so I could feel safer there, which wasn't a very nice message to get around sexuality as well.
Oh, it's also, it's interesting. I'm hearing in what you're saying, like when we see something going wrong, what do we try to change? Do we try to change the person? Do we try to change the bullies? Do we try to change the situation? And sometimes people can be well-meaning, but what they're essentially doing is saying, it's really the fault of the fact that you're here that this is happening. So let's put you somewhere else, and then maybe everything will be okay. It's like a
Yeah.
lot of messages that are being given at that point. And you mentioned sort of getting messages from the broader Jewish community, sort of being in synagogue, that kind of thing. Can you go a little more into that?
I guess, I mean, it wasn't necessarily a spoken thing, but people do treat you differently, I guess. And it was difficult, I think, at school and in synagogue, it was difficult to know why I was treated differently. But I kind of, I guess now, after years of therapy, have much more understanding of kind of when people are homophobic, that it's not necessarily, it can be ever so subtle, but ever so clear at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So then you're sort of growing up and you're coming out of your teen stage and into your young adulthood. And what is all of this looking like for you at that time?
So I guess at that time, I left secondary school. I was very pleased to be leaving secondary school and ending my school days. But I then went to Chef's College, and at Chef's College, part of the interview, the interviewer said to me, "Well, you might need to rethink your faith." I mean, I don't imagine they could say that today, but certainly then they said you need to rethink your faith because you need to taste the food. So I went to speak to lots of different Orthodox caterers, but most of them were about sugar and had tasted the food at some stage. Um, so I went back to him and just said, yeah, I've rethought it. But throughout kind of my catering school days, I just got other people to taste the food. And when the same person gave me my certificate at the end of the course, and I told him that I actually never needed to rethink my faith, but thank you.
It seems like in a lot of ways in your life, you were in one space being told that the other parts of your identity needed to be put to one side. Like, I'm interested in, what does it mean to sort of integrate those and live together with all of those aspects of your identity?
I guess it's felt like that's happened in different spaces as well. So I think for a long time, I guess, kind of the hedonistic life and the gay scene was a bit like my synagogue at the weekends. That's where I could go and escape and be with community. And it wasn't an easy time. So there was this lovely kind of dance floor life in London, but just beyond that, there were people in hospices, there were friends getting ill and sick.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're growing up through that and trying to figure out who you are with all of that as a backdrop, which I imagine, must have been particularly tricky. You tell this amazing story in the book about sort of coming out when it came to your family, your parents, especially who like, hi, lovely to see you. Would you just tell us a little bit about sort of the experience of coming out in these sort of multiple ways as you walk you through this?
So it was a bit of a timeline experience in terms of parents. So initially I came out to my sister, and she was very loving and supportive and told me that she would never reject me. Um, my the conversation with my mother was a bit more kind of challenging because I hadn't really kind of prepared myself for the conversation. But I had said that I was going clubbing. I kept saying that I was going to a friend's birthday in London to Heaven nightclub. And my mother just kept asking me why, why on earth would you want to be out going to a gay club? Um, and eventually I came out and said that I'm queer, I'm gay. And at that time, because I had all these stereotypes in my head, this was well before I had HIV, but I said to my mum that I wouldn't get HIV. Um, and also, we could do something about children if and when that choice happens. Um, with my dad, it was slightly different. So my dad worked very hard. I was interviewed in town and very naively on his computer, they asked me to kind of type out my coming out story. It was an old BBC computer. And it just kind of shut down. I thought my coming out story had got lost and I'll start it up the next day. My dad got home quite late at night. And when he kind of turned his computer on, my coming out story came out the printer and he read it then. And at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I felt this heavy weight at the end of my bed, and my dad was very upset. And in the article I had written that I come from an Orthodox background, my biggest fear was that my dad would reject me. Instead, he went to his office the next day and looked on the internet, found me an LGBT community, also an LGBT synagogue, which was Beit Hillel at the time, and wanted to do his utmost to kind of prove that he wouldn't do that.
It's a beautiful story. I love that story of your dad going and immediately finding a place where you could be, part of the LGBT community and also part of the Jewish community at the same time. In a way, it's thinking several steps ahead, right?
Mm.
It's not just being okay with this element of your identity. It's actually exactly what we're talking about tonight in all of this sort of intersectionality, multifaceted identity. You are not, Jewish over here and part of the LGBT community over here. They can be the same thing. I think in some ways, thinking very far ahead for your dad at that point.
What I can say is that it's very nice to see Edward Tika here because he was part of that elder community that I kind of met at the time as well.
Amazing. It's not reinventing the wheel. I think in certain ways, every kid who comes out feels like they're the first kid who's ever come out. I very much remember that, despite knowing people in my life who'd come out before. The first time always feels like you're reinventing the wheel, and there's a part of it that's like, actually, people have done this before. Yeah.
But also at the time there wasn't that many, well, particularly in my community. I mean, it's interesting that some of my closest family friends, the kids, also came out, but we didn't know each other existed in that way at the time or for a long time as well.
Yeah, amazing. I'm always interested in how young people, when they come out, it often turns out that a whole bunch of their friends are also queer in some way, and it's like they find each other before we even know that we're looking for each other.
Yeah.
Amazing. So in all of this, we've talked about sexuality and we haven't talked about sort of gender and identity and that kind of stuff. Is any of that on your mind back then? Like, how is that sitting with you?
So I guess, we didn't have in the school that I went to, I won't say the name, but it was in Camden Town. There weren't that many schools in Camden Town. And it was basically, we didn't have inclusive education. So I didn't understand the terminology LGBT until I got to catering college, really. That's where I was allowed to be free, really. But yeah, we were in a time of Section 28. I didn't really get it. I didn't get why I was different, mainly.
Can you just define Section 28 for us?
Yeah, so there's lots of confusion. So it was actually for local education boards rather than schools. But Margaret Thatcher very cleverly confused education. And it was the act that prevented schools basically providing inclusive education. But it didn't just do that, it also, if there were LGBT teachers in school, because of Section 28, they also often lost their jobs at the time.
Yeah. So not only are you not learning about it, you're also not seeing people who are living their lives that way when you're a young child going through this.
Yeah.
It really does shape a generation, I think.
I mean, it's so nice today to see open and out teachers that can be role models to their young people.
And in a lot of ways, it's happened very quickly, which I think is also interesting that we can talk about your childhood that way. And you're not very old, Chai-Yoel. So the fact that we can talk about your childhood that way is, in some ways, there's a lot to be hopeful about if we've come that far.
Yeah, but in terms of gender and sexuality, I guess I didn't have an inclusive language. We definitely didn't have terminology like genderqueer back then. Transgender was still not really part of the LGBT community until much later on.
I love that you almost can't get it out of your mouth without the T. Yeah. It's beautiful. Yeah, so when are you coming across these kinds of concepts and sort of figuring out how that works for you?
So much later on, I guess. So yeah, I contracted HIV in 2004. I'm soon going into my 20th year of living with the virus. But ever since I contracted it, I've been in therapy and really kind of been understanding kind of where is my identity. And because a lot of the community I was with was more on the kind of gender bending, dressing up for a Saturday night out, I think if my sexual health clinic had asked the right questions in the right way around gender, I probably would have started understanding gender much earlier on, and didn't come out as non-binary until like 5 or 6 years ago.
It's so important to have language for things, to be able to realize also that we're not the only ones. Like I said before about reinventing the wheel, like this is something that other people have felt and feel too. You talked a little bit about sort of being in therapy, but you've also, of course, gone through this whole thing to be on the other side of that and helping other people through. Can you just talk us through the decision to enter into that world and a little bit about how that's shaped you?
So I'm sure my mother would kind of tell you what she often says about this. So she kind of I can't remember, Mum, exactly how you say it, but she always says that I kind of, when I was a chef, I cooked for other people, had to work long hours, but went home feeling good because I had filled people's stomachs. These days, I work long hours as a psychotherapist and feel good because I leave people psychologically nourished, I guess.
That's lovely. They're not so far apart as concepts.
Yeah, definitely. But I guess I ended my hospitality and catering days kind of as an assistant reception manager in a hotel in London. And it was more that I wanted to do something completely different. So I went and initially qualified, did a access course in social care, social work, and then started to work as an LGBT youth worker, going into schools and teaching about homophobia, sexuality, and also discrimination. And I guess that really turned kind of my own school experience on its head. It was very challenging because there was lots of confusion left even after Section 28 disappeared. Lots of schools still thought it was illegal to talk about these issues in school. I remember this first school that I went to speak in was in Hackney, and all the teachers in the room, in the assembly, left the room because they didn't think they should be there, and I was left in the room with 400 students talking about pride. And within that window, I guess, over time, I worked as an LGBT youth worker for about 10 years and kind of worked in education. I got to a point where I felt that I wasn't cool enough to stay with the music of the young people as I was getting older. So I moved over into sexual health, HIV prevention and care, and did that for another 10 years.
How have you felt about progress through all of that, seeing it over that period of time? Like, do you feel like it has been fairly linear? Do you think that we've been sort of going back and forth in terms of social progress around this? You've sort of seen a whole generation of kids grow up with all of that.
Well, I guess, I mean, yeah, I think the noughties and the 90s and noughties were very good for our LGBT plus community. Lots of laws and policies came in to the point where we've got equal rights to marriage, I guess. But when I'm talking to young people, it's more like all this terminology is not new to them. They get it all and they want to be seen, whether that's because of kind of Facebook, or I'm probably showing my age even with Facebook, but sort of Instagram or the other social media channels. It's a very much this is us now generation. And so they very much want to talk about gender identity, sexuality. It's very important to them. And that's really lovely to see.
Amazing, thank you. The chicken soup thing, chicken soup of identity. Can you talk us through, like, how did you make the decision about that, and what does that actually mean?
So I guess, I mean, for me, it's kind of where threads intersect and where they don't. And like I said earlier, very much I felt like at one stage my faith needed to be over here and my gender or sexuality needed to be over there. And also for a long time didn't necessarily feel like I could bring my sexuality into my family as well, or into my community.
Thank you. And then, at a certain point, it's you're thinking about gender and the whole non-binary conversation, and we have language for it. Yeah, and you said it's fairly recent that you've started being so open about it. Can you just tell us a little about what that means for you? We'll get a little bit more, I think, into some of the technical stuff, but let's just start with Chai-Yoel. Like, what does it mean for you? What has coming out all over again been like?
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, where it all started was I used to go to a yearly retreat called Loving Men. At the retreat, they would have a drag workshop room, and I was put in a dorm with mainly older gay men, and I felt really uncomfortable being in a room with men. So went and slept in the drag workshop room. I took my mattress there. And in that night, I went to sleep and I had this weird dream where doctors were taking bits of my body and nurses were putting other bits of my body. And in my private practice, I'd slowly seen a shift from seeing 99% men who have sex with men populations to suddenly attracting trans, gender fluid, and non-binary people. And suddenly I went into my next therapy session and I said, something's kind of going on here around gender, and we need to explore that dream a bit. And they sat with me and gave me all kind of different labels and terminology, which I had done with lots of other people. And then when I was looking at kind of genderqueer, non-binary, I finally kind of felt like, oh, that's landing.
That's so interesting. So what I said earlier about how, I think a lot of queer people recognize this, right? The queer kids just end up being friends with each other before knowing that anyone's actually queer. It's really interesting. I'm hearing that in what you're saying. It's like, people just around you without even knowing why there's an attraction, and then recognizing that there's something going on with your gender identity too. It's beautiful.
Definitely.
And what's the process been like of sort of living as a person outside of this kind of binary that the world keeps trying to force us into?
I guess when you start having a new terminology, you kind of understand why things feel quite uncomfortable. So things like male changing rooms are only for men, and female changing rooms are for women. And where do you belong if you don't fit into those two binaries? But also just how much people want to prescribe a binary on you as well. And I guess that starts for us at birth, where the doctor looks at our bits and decides whether we're a boy or a girl. But there's so much more to identifying in that way as well.
Absolutely. And I hear in what you're saying about not having had the language for it before. Like, as Jews, we are a people of sacred language. Like, having language for things, having ways to express things is actually really important to us.
Mm.
And so I see something, very connected about the idea of, like, I don't know this thing about myself. I don't understand this thing about myself until I have terminology for it. And, language can be very freeing.
Mm. And I guess then a whole question kind of started cropping up. Well, this name that I had doesn't fit anymore with how I'm identifying. Um, and It was quite difficult because obviously your name is in Judaism is often after somebody special in the family that parents have decided. It's also the first free gift your parents give to you. So when I was coming out as non-binary to my parents, one of the questions was, I want to change my name. Um, is that okay? Or can I have your blessing? And they said yes. So I took elements of my Hebrew name. I don't mind saying my old Hebrew name. I probably won't be saying my English name because it's still kind of my old English name because it kind of makes me uncomfortable. But yeah, I always kind of love looking at rabbis trying to remember my long Hebrew name, and they would often count each finger to remember it. So it was Chaim Shlomo Zalman Ben Yosef Mordechai HaKohen. And it's quite a lot of words, but I decided to kind of reclaim Chai out of Chaim to make it more gender neutral, and then to not let my old name disappear completely, I took on the name Yoel instead.
Really beautiful. And I want to take you a little more into the name change thing. But before we do that, I think it would be great to get from you a little bit of a sense of, all of this terminology, all of this stuff around, what is intersectionality? Would you just take us into some of those sort of more educational elements?
Yeah, let me see whether I can share my screen. So just bear with me. Daniela, if I can't do this, then I think I've sent you the present.
I'll share my screen if you can't. Why don't you try and then I'll.
Yeah, it's got a warning sign.
That's fine. Why don't I share mine and then you can just let me know when I should transition.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Oh, it's come out quite oddly, so I hope the rest of it works. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so let me talk first a bit about intersectionality. So the term intersectionality came from a Black feminist scholar, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, in 1989 in her paper Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. And intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of one's social, political identities, be it gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, etc., might combine to create unique modes of discrimination. Go to next slide. This means we need to be aware of the parts of our identity that might be part of the dominant group, that may carry more power and which may be less dominant. We look at privileges that are the advantages, rewards, and/or benefits given to those in the dominant group without members of the dominant group asking for them. So I love this kind of diagram by Rabbi Daniel Potzenberg, which really kind of shows, I think the bigger circles are the areas that were more important to them, and the smaller circles are where they're less seen or less visible. And this gives us a really nice picture of what intersectionality is. And as a transcultural therapist, I guess, as Jewish, we may be visible in ethnicity, but we still can be invisible in the wider white world as well. So let me kind of give you a little bit of a theoretical, theoretical model around gender, sex, and sexual orientation. This is the biosocial model. So in this, we look at gender, usually seen as kind of one of two sexes, male or female, or even intersex as well. Sex is sexual activity and the medical view of male and female binary, and sexual orientation is a person's identity in relation to the gender they're attracted to. So here we have a lovely, inclusive, gender unicorn way of looking at gender identity and gender expression and sexuality. So this is really helpful, and you're welcome to look and think about your own identities after this session today using this frame. But I guess gender identity is kind of female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, and many other genders. And I guess in some ways in the Western world, we're kind of limited to just having a few different genders, including kind of non-binariness or transness. But if we go to the Eastern world, there are many other ways of expressing gender and it being normal to express gender in different ways. Gender expression is often kind of how we dress, what we look like. So are we dressing more masculine, feminine, or are we more kind of gender fluid? And then sex assigned at birth, female, male, other, intersex. And then, what I really like about this is that it's a huge spectrum and nobody's at one end or the other. So physically attracted to women, men, other genders, and emotionally attracted to women, men, and other genders. So this is a really nice frame of reference. Oh, we'll come back to this later.
Thank you for taking us through some of that. The chat is open if people have questions you want to throw in. If anything didn't make sense to you and you want us to clarify, I'm sure that Chai-Yoel will be happy to. And at this point, having done some of the terminology, having done some of your story, we're also here because we're part of the Masorti movement, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how this all sort of came to be within Masorti Judaism for you, and I guess then we get to talk a little bit about us and our connection as well. But with all of this information that you have, all of this terminology that you've learned, all of this sort of self-identity and self-expression, how did you come to reintegrate this into your sort of Jewish identity and hold them together rather than separately? Could you just take us into some of that?
Yeah, certainly. So I was quite involved in terms of the Jewish LGBT community. So one of the groups that my father originally found was JGLG, Jewish Lesbian and Gay Group, which I think is now Jewish LGBT, to be more inclusive. And within that community, I met kind of what I would I'm sure they don't like the word being used about them, but I met lots of LGBT elders who provided me some community whilst kind of my parents were kind of getting used to me being originally queer, gay, and I really enjoyed kind of having that sense of community. At the time, it was very much more based in the liberal and the reform movement, and kind of having grown up in the United movement, that felt very, very far away from kind of my background and what I was used to. So it was really important for me to find a synagogue where I could bring all of myself. So when I was looking around at synagogues, I met with Rabbi Jeremy Gordon, and we had a very long conversation, I'm sure you can imagine. But he was absolutely really inclusive. He has also been very supportive when I've had health issues. So it really became clear to me that this was the right space. It holds on to some of the traditional elements of kind of modern orthodoxy that I wanted to hold on to, but also initially kind of moved more to female inclusion in the community, and that started me feeling more comfortable in that frame, and then kind of started having an internal conversation about LGBT inclusivism, to the point where you've kind of got an LGBT policy these days around synagogue. And that felt really important to me. I've always found that I can bring my complete self to services and be me.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's also really interesting that, we've been on a journey too, that the Masorti movement is still figuring certain things out. And, we're very lucky to have Daniela around nowadays doing a lot of really important holy work.
Mm,
But, from some of the things that might have felt obvious that we needed to get there, like being able to do same-sex weddings, to much more recently figuring out how we call people up to Torah when our language sort of pushes us into a gender binary, and some people don't want to be pushed into a gender binary. We are still very much working on it,
mm,
and grateful for patience and guidance. And I think it's very interesting on that front that when you joined the Masorti movement, it was still very obvious that there was a lot of work to be done. And how did that feel for you when you sort of first came in, and it was neither the sort of orthodoxy of your childhood nor some of the more obviously welcoming shuls that maybe were less traditional.
mm. I think what I noticed is that people really had a willingness to move to more inclusive. It was more like, what can we do to make you feel more at home here? Whereas in more Orthodox synagogues, it would be more leaning to, please don't tell anybody, or it's not very safe here. Um,
It's interesting. It's what we were saying earlier about the you being asked to change in the bathroom,
hmm,
right? It's when there's bullying going on, where do we see the root of the problem and therefore the root of what we need to change?
hmm,
Um, I wonder if there's a connection there, like at least there's a recognition that we need to change rather than you needing to change.
hmm. And also, not just being willing to change, but also now has a paid employed person around LGBT inclusion, which should happen across the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And then, you and I got in contact and started talking actually, about how to, originally it was how do we call people up who
Hmm,
are non-binary? And I'll just share, it was almost bizarrely easy to get that dealt with within New London. I was very new at the time, and so I didn't necessarily know everyone as well as I do now. I would know now everyone's lovely, but sort of went into this with, wrote out a system for how to call people up, went into it assuming that there was going to be pushback. No pushback whatsoever. To me at least, no one has mentioned anything about being uncomfortable with non-binary call-ups. We've done it multiple times now. It all sometimes I feel like we assume that there's going to be so much tension about something, and it turns out people surprise you sometimes,
yeah,
which is very nice.
definitely, definitely. And I guess, I mean, our conversation really began around my chosen name as well. I guess for me, I mean, part of my background is that I used to go to the queer fairy movement. I'm not going to explain all of what the queer fairy movement is, but is very much more on the kind of hippie side of queerdom. Um, and in terms of kind of growing up, kind of the rituals and the traditions of faith have been really important to me. So I wanted to do something around my name to really make it land both in a Jewish way, but also in an embodied way as well.
Amazing. Yeah. So we got into conversation and we wrote a ritual. and Chai-Yoel went to mikvah, and we had an absolutely lovely day. I'm just gonna, just because I've got it here, I think I might as well show you, not you, Chai-Yoel, you know this well, but the rest of you, just something of what we did. As well as going to the mikvah, we talked about different elements of poetry to use, and Chai-Yoel did the Shema in front of the Ark, and had just some loving, lovely people around, and I was very honored to be able to give a blessing in the modern sort of Hebrew non-binary project grammar, which is difficult to get one's mouth around when one is used to Hebrew sounding a certain way. Although frankly, sometimes it's hard to get one's mouth around the feminine in a lot of things when you're so used to seeing them in the masculine as well. So this is that blessing that we put together. And just, I think, one of the most fantastic brachot that we have, that I think is very relevant to the conversations around gender. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, she'asani kirtzono, who made me according to God's will. This is traditionally the blessing that women say in the morning when men are saying, "Thank God for not making me a woman." That we don't tend to do that in our shul, but I just think I think it wraps up so much of this. The concept of being able to be integrated as a Jew and as a queer person and as a non-binary person. It's like, what does it mean to live as fully as I can according to the way that God made me?
Do you want, Rabbi Natasha, do you want to say something about kind of the kind of moving more to inclusion around kind of saying my Hebrew name, but rather also saying instead of saying kind of yes,
Yes. So you sort of settled on me Bait instead of Ben or Bat. So Ben and Bat being sort of forced into that binary of daughter of or son of. Me Bait means from the house of. Which is both lovely linguistically because it sounds so familiar to us as people who are used to saying Ben or Bat, but also I think is a lovely way to honor where we come from, and I think you honor that really well in your name, both the sense of individual identity and where I'm going, and the sense of where I came from, and what these names are from my family, from my loved ones. So I think that gets well encapsulated into me Bait as well. I have to move us forward because we are just minutes away from needing to say goodbye. And I just want to ask. I have one question in the chat that I want to ask, and I'm sorry to everyone else who I'm sure has lots of questions too. And I have one question, and then I'm going to hand over to Daniela. The question from the chat is this. Is it difficult to decide or advise others where one feels one is on a wide spectrum of identity and sexuality? In your experience, does this change with age or through one's relationships? Which I just think is a fantastic question, because you're kind of going through this on both sides. What does that mean to you?
I mean, I talk about it a bit in the book. So, and I've had this really frank conversation with some of my gender diverse clients, and what they've said is sometimes when they've gone to people who don't get it, haven't gone on specific training around gender diversity, they feel that they're put in the role of teacher, and they're there to be a patient, not to teach somebody about their gender and sexuality. But I see it as this beautiful metaphor that we're both on a ship together learning about gender, what gender means to us, which might move and change with time, but hopefully together we'll also get to dry land at the end of it safely.
That's a lovely metaphor. Thank you for sharing that. And the last question that I think is really important for us, and I'm sure important for multiple people here, we are unfortunately living in a society with a lot of transphobia. And in terms of that, I think also in terms of sexuality and all of the other ways in which one walks in the world, how is it that we can be better allies? What is it that you want us to take from this going forward that we can do?
Yeah, certainly. I'm just going to my notes because I'm not holding them today. So I guess learn more about the varied lives and experience of, I would say, LGBTQ people through film, books, and in life. Except that
It's a
people
good
have.
place to start. It's a good
Yeah.
place to start. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Okay, sorry. And remember that if you're feeling uncomfortable, it's for you to reflect on, not for the person who is LGBTQ plus to fix that feeling for you. And ask respectful and appropriate questions around gender, sexuality, gender transition. These are all very personal journeys, and try to avoid direct questions. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Beautiful, thank you. We are all always learning on this. And I think, fantastically interesting to hear about how you've been learning about yourself too, and learning about the world around you. There's a whole thing with Judaism I think about a lot of the time when people are converting, but also when people are ordained, which is that there's a certain level of it which is recognizing that we are always supposed to be learning, that you don't get to the point where it's like, well, I fixed that now, I know everything. And I think that humility, being able to be humble about what we do and don't understand, is really important, and I hear that very much in what you're saying. Chai-Yoel, you've been such a pleasure to talk to tonight, and just so open and vulnerable with us, and I want to thank you really deeply for everything that you've shared with us tonight. Thank you for being here and a part of our movement and helping us to better ourselves too.
You're welcome, and it was a pleasure.
Wonderful. I'm going to hand back over to Daniela at this point.
Thank you so much. Hang on, I'm going to spotlight myself. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Natasha, for facilitating tonight's conversation, but especially thank you, Chai-Yoel. I think the reason I asked you to share with us tonight is that the beautiful way, both in writing and when speaking to us, you're able to intertwine your own deeply personal and often have been challenging experiences, along with a wider understanding of experiences of other LGBTQ plus individuals, both in the context of the world which you and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, but also so much to be positive about, and thinking about that within our Masorti context, and how 3-4 years ago we didn't really have any Pride events, and now this is the first of many other Pride events that we have going on this month. And so thank you. We are all deeply, I think, indebted to you for the emotional work you've done with us tonight. So thank you very much. And as I said, this is the first of many events on a broader Masorti LGBT plus level, although I know our synagogues have already started. We've had Pride Shabbat at New Stoke Newington Synagogue already. We've had events, I know, at Shema Community, and we have many Pride Shabbat events coming up on the 30th of June and the 1st of July. The link I've pasted does not appear to have come out as I wanted to, but if you go to masorti.org.uk, and there we have a button on our main page, it says Pride events, and that will link to things that are happening both through the Masorti LGBT plus network, which I co-convene, and we have now coming up for 100 Masorti LGBT plus members from pretty much all of our communities across the country. And we including a picnic coming up this Sunday, but there are, like I said, there's lists all the synagogue-based things that are going on as well. In terms of further learning, there is the beautiful book that Chai-Yoel has contributed to. A little plug myself. I am fortunate enough that Chai-Yoel is contributing to a book that I'm editing on LGBT plus people of faith, telling more of their story. So I think moving beyond where you were at when you first told your story in non-binary lives. And so that would be really lovely to read when it comes out. One more thing you might like to read on your journey, those of you who have joined us tonight and those who are watching later on, Chaver Up is a really lovely book that was published by Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, known as the LGBT plus or the Queer Synagogue in New York, and 49 rabbis, as you can see, talk about what it means to be an ally through a Jewish lens. So another lovely book. So much for you to learn from. But thank you, Chai-Yoel, and thank you everyone for being with us this evening. And I hope we see you at more Pride events and more Masorti events throughout the month and the year. Good night, all.